Hello. If you're like me and you've had a lot more time in your hands this past year, you've probably been pretty daunted by the challenge of finding ways to spend it productively. It can feel like a lot of pressure to finally do all the stuff that you've never gotten around to because you're usually too busy. I think I've done pretty well. I've started exercising more, doing these regular home workouts, which I've really enjoyed.
If it's a little bit difficult for you, come down onto your knees.
Oh, fuck off, Tom!
I mean, I even managed to make some new friends.
Yes, John.
But I think something we've all done during quarantine is finally watch that movie or TV show that 1,000 people have recommended to you, everyone keeps telling you to watch it, and that honestly makes you want to watch it less. I think there's something deeply human about never watching a second of Stranger Things because someone you hold at most slight disdain for wore the ice cream costume for Halloween once. But what it was for me was that I finally played through the entirety of The Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt. Now, for those of you who don't know what it is, The Witcher 3 is an RPG action adventure game made by a Polish company called CD Projekt Red. You may have heard of them from the news. And it's widely considered among gamers as one of, if not the best, mainstream game of the last generation. And a huge reason of why it's considered that is because of how it uses player choice. You know, these days, lots of games have gorgeous, detailed open game worlds or narratives that rival movies or TV shows, but very few games have given the player as much agency as they have in The Witcher 3, where your choices can have huge consequences on the story and game world. Now, this matters for a lot of reasons. I mean, for one, player interactivity and agency is the foundation of all video games. It's what makes it different from other forms of media. A lot of the stuff people hate in video games is when control is taken away from the player or it's cheapened in some way. But the main reason why choice in video games is so important is that many argue it has the potential to push the boundaries of storytelling. The basic theory is that if you give players choices that have meaningful consequences in the story, it can lead to this heightened level of immersion and these profound narrative experiences where the story can feel personalized to the player. That is the theory, but in my experience, choices in video games usually fall into one of two categories. The first category, and the ones that are the most common, are the simple good versus evil choices. They may not even affect the main story at all if it's like Red Dead's honor system, but if they do, they can kind of be cut out entirely because most players just pick the good option. Like, you can kind of label this category of game choices killing children bad. But then you have the other category of choice, which is essentially the polar opposite, where these choices are super integral to the game, they might even be the main mechanic, and most of the time you don't have the faintest idea of which choice is better. And whilst these are obviously more engaging and better than the simple good versus evil choices, I've often found them just very stressful to actually play. Because making the wrong decision in these choices not only makes you feel like an idiot, it can also radically affect your game for the worse. It could get a character you really like killed, or you could even get a bad ending to the whole story. If anything, games with this type of choice in it are kind of designed to be replayed so you can see how deep the story goes and how things could have turned out differently. The problem with this is not just that very few of us have the time or patience to replay games, but that theory of an immersive, personalized story arguably doesn't work as well if it's your second or third time going through the game. So I've always had a very tentative relationship with choice in video games. I thought it was cool in theory, but I didn't want to actually go through them. This is what has stopped me from playing The Witcher 3 for so long, because all I heard was this unimaginable hype that it was like the best game story ever. But I also heard that it had like 36 different endings, which made me want to be sick. I think we've all had that anxiety before watching a certain hyped movie or TV show where you can feel almost nervous if you're going to like it as much as everyone else. You don't want to feel left out or like you didn't get what everyone else thought was so great. And I put off The Witcher 3 kind of because of a more extreme version of that anxiety. I was scared of messing up the choices and getting a shitty version of what many people call the best game story they've ever played. And I realized that this is a problem that can really only come with video games. Like, people often misinterpret movies, but it's not like one audience can get a totally different ending, especially one that just isn't as good. It would be like watching Citizen Kane and being like, ah yes, Rosebud, it was his horse. But it made me think about choice in video games as a whole, and whether this theory we have about it unlocking the next level of video game storytelling can actually be realistic. So today I want to talk about 3 different games and how they approach the Catch-22 of choice in video games. People think player choice is what's going to make video game storytelling unique and special. But both game designers and players are faced with the same paradoxical challenge. How do you tell an effective story when you let the audience choose how it plays out? I know right now some of you are going, I don't think that's Catch-22, to which I say, you're probably right, I haven't read the fucking book. You know we had to talk about it at some point, but I do think Cyberpunk 2077 is a prime example of the inherent problem with giving players choice in video game stories. Now I played Cyberpunk 2077 before I did The Witcher 3. I bought it on launch, I put over 40 hours into it, and I got badly burned. But not in the way you may think. You see, for the most part, I actually really enjoyed the game. I just built a new PC, so I didn't have as many graphical problems as other people, but I also got my first taste of what CD Projekt Red had become famous for with their Witcher games. And it's that they helped revolutionize the side quest as an art form, and they did that through effective use of player choice. They're not all amazing, but there are more than a fair few that explore compelling characters and complex situations where your decisions will radically affect how they play out. It revitalizes these otherwise forgettable side jobs like the boxing missions where after beating a guy you can decide to let him take the winnings because he's got a baby on the way. Now while some side quests do have knock-on effects to the main story, the rest are completely self-contained, so it's not the biggest deal if you mess up a choice. However, that is not of course the case with the main quest, where the stakes around your choices are much higher. Basically, right before you do the final story mission, you are faced with several options, and whichever one you choose will decide the ending you get to the whole story of the game. Now, of course, in order for me to properly discuss these ending choices, I'm gonna have to give you a rundown on the main story of Cyberpunk 2077. So heads up if you are worried about spoilers. Also good news if you've always thought video games are lame and for nerds. You're about to be proved correct. Basically, you start the game as a character called V, who can come from one of 3 different life paths. Either a rough and tumble street kid, a corporate employee, or a nomad who lives on the outskirts of Night City. But these life paths are kind of glorified 30-minute tutorials before your character is thrust out of that life and meets Jackie Wells, who becomes your partner as you rise the ranks of Night City's underworld. You then get hired to do a heist where you have to steal a biochip from this big bad corporation called Arasaka, but that of course all goes wrong, and you witness the son of the CEO murder him and cover it up. You then barely escape with your life, but the rest of your crew dies, and you have to put the biochip in your neck because you're a robot man and you can. You then get double-crossed by the guy who hired you to do the heist, who shoots you in the head. But this doesn't kill you, it instead triggers the resurrection of the cyber ghost of Keanu Reeves, who plays Johnny Silverhand, a famous rock star from 50 years ago who launched an anti-capitalist revolution against Arasaka. But his attack on the corporation's tower also went wrong, and they kidnapped him and took his personality and put it in the biochip. Hence now he is, as I said before, a cyber ghost living in your head. You then get told by your doctor friend that, like a 13-year-old who just bought Welcome to the Black Parade, your whole personality is now in serious jeopardy. Eventually, Johnny, or Keanu Reeves' memories are going to overtake yours, and that's going to kill you in the process. So the both of you set out on a mission to get this chip out your head and save your own life in the process, making a few friends along the way. You eventually find out that the biochip was created by Johnny's ex-girlfriend, who is also, you guessed it, a big cyber ghost. Now, she created this AI called Soul Killer, and that's the technology that allowed Arasaka to take his personality and put it in the biochip. This now brings us back to the ending choices, where you have to decide how you are going to launch an attack on the corporation's main tower and destroy the Soul Killer technology once and for all. You're essentially given 3 options here. You can either go alone with the help of a shady insider, you can enlist the help of whichever character you romance throughout the game, or you can give control over to Johnny, who wants to settle his old scores with Arasaka and make amends with his past girlfriend, who we also met throughout the game. Now, why I was so nervous to make this choice was that I was actually quite invested in the main story and I wanted to see it properly resolved. Now, regardless of the life path you took, the kind of overarching story of your main character V is to take over Night City. It's in all the adverts, it's kind of a common meta goal for all open world RPGs. My character was constantly talking about how he wanted to become this legend of Night City, and honestly, it made me want to really not, because it sounded so embarrassing every time he said it.
You want to rule this city? I'm in. Cyberpunk 2077.
But because of the chip in your head, you start to relive Johnny's memories, who actually was a legend of Night City. And lo and behold, it's super cringy. It's this weird, like, teenage boy fantasy, played surprisingly straight. Like, just look at the reload animation on his gun. Johnny shoots a pistol like I played the drums when I was 15. There's a lot of unnecessary flipping going on, and it's just generally not very good. But all cringe aside, I got really invested in this story of my character whose sole interest in life was to become this legend of Night City, but is now dying because a washed up one lives in his head. But their relationship was actually quite interesting to watch, because to start with, they don't like each other at all, and to be honest, you as the player don't like them either. But you see how eventually they both change. Johnny witnesses how his revolutionary cause has become irrelevant, and that he actually hurt people in his past life because he was so caught up in it. But equally, he calls V out on his bullshit and tries to mobilize him to fight for his life. Basically, you were like two asshole dude bros who learned to be better people by sharing an asshole. So this is why I ultimately went with the decision to give Johnny control. Not just because I wanted to see Johnny right the wrongs of his past that were set up throughout the story, but I also wanted my character to learn the lessons from Johnny and put his loved ones above this reckless crusade to become a legend. You know, they also talk about how every choice is risky, so as much as I liked the character that I had a romance with, I thought bringing her along is a one-way ticket to getting her killed. So after giving Johnny control, we enlist the help of an old flame of his, we launch an attack on Arasaka, defeat the big bad guy, and we finally get to Soul Killer and destroy it. However, we do all this only to be told by Johnny's ex-girlfriend Cyberghost that we still only have 6 months to live. Then started what is not only one of the most confusing endings to a game I've ever gotten in my life, but it was also the exact opposite of what I wanted to happen. You, as Johnny in V's body, now have the choice whether to run away with it or to give it back to him and trap yourself in cyberspace forever. Now, I obviously decided for Johnny to give V his body back. I wanted to see him make that sacrifice, but it was played very somber. But anyway, you wake up as V, back in his own body, and he's living in a nice apartment with his love interest. And I thought, great, this is sort of what I wanted to happen. Well, for some reason, you turn her down when she asks if you want to go away with her, even though there's no real reason to why you shouldn't, and you don't even get a choice in that. Instead, you become the head of the criminal underworld, and thus the legend of Night City. You then take a rocket ship to a space casino to pull off one final big heist and likely die a sad, angry man floating in space. What? And much to my dismay, I realized that if you pick what I thought was the most obvious option and bring your romance, you got the ending that I was kind of hoping for. She doesn't die, someone else less important does. Johnny still has to sacrifice himself, but it's played a lot more heroically, and you then get this bittersweet and hopeful ending where you and your love interest leave Night City together and look for a cure. Now, I do realize that it's kind of ridiculous for me to criticize a game for not servicing the exact story I had in my head when I made the choice. My reasons could be very misguided or just not what they were going for. After all, it would be kind of impossible to write multiple endings to one story that are all somehow satisfying in their own way. And this is a huge part of, as the chapter title states, the problem. Because in a conventional narrative, there is one plot. There is a main character who encounters a crisis, things are set up and paid off in an ending that hopefully resolves that crisis in a satisfying way. But if you want to include meaningful choice in video games, i.e. the kind of ones that will actually alter the story and lead to multiple different endings, that means that only one of them is going to do all of that. One of them will be the best or intended ending that makes the most narrative sense. All the other multiple endings, no matter how well written they are, will technically be the bad endings or ones that aren't canon to the main story. You could argue, well, just don't get a bad ending. Game designers should just work to ensure that a majority of players who are paying attention get the good ending. The problem with that is the only way to guarantee a majority of players get the best ending is either to make the choices too predictable or settle with a simple good versus evil choice. So game designers have to give players choices that are more complex, ones that might have multiple possible outcomes in the story. But the obvious pitfall here is that you risk alienating the audience, who are just trying their best to follow your story. Swapna Krishna in Wired excellently highlighted this problem. She mentioned how a lot of times in video games it can feel like you don't have the right information to be making such important narrative choices. It can feel like you're gambling when you make these huge choices, just hoping that it leads you to a good ending. And if it doesn't, like what happened to me, it can be especially frustrating when you are actually invested in the story. Playing Cyberpunk 2077, I didn't feel like I was making this personalized, immersive story with my choices. I felt like I was desperately trying to satisfy the requirements of a pre-written one. So a proposed way of getting around all of this and dealing with the problem of meaningful player choice in a conventional narrative is to make it unconventional. Instead of just having one plot with one intended ending, a game designer can include multiple plot lines and multiple points of crisis in a game. And the ending that a player gets only resolves the plot lines that the player picked. But this presents its own host of issues, because throughout Cyberpunk 2077, I picked up on various plot lines. I got a love interest, I found out about Johnny's ex, I found out about his struggles as well as my own. I went through all those story points, but there is no ending in the game that resolves all of them together, even in the technically best ending. Those choices at the end of Cyberpunk 2077 essentially become, which plotline do you want to see resolved? If you want closure for Johnny, then you pick his path, but your romance side plot is discarded. If you pick your romance, that's given closure, but not Johnny's past. Basically, it is extremely difficult to give players the power to pick and choose plotlines throughout the game, and somehow expect a coherent narrative to come out the other end. This problem was actually brought up by Roger Ebert in his infamous article where he argued that video games weren't art. I love Roger Ebert, but his arguments here are so painfully obtuse. It's low-key hilarious. I genuinely urge you to read it. I just think there's something genuinely fascinating about a man who knows nothing about a topic, yet cracks out with the most cast-iron opinion on it. It would be like if I booted down the doors of Dolce & Gabbana and was just like, "You call this fashion?" Because his article is essentially responding to a TED Talk done by Kellee Santiago, and she was arguing that games are art because their interactivity allows for different players to have different emotional experiences and journeys. Ebert responded that, if you can go through every emotional journey available, doesn't that devalue each and every one of them? Art seeks you to lead an inevitable conclusion, not a smorgasbord of choices. And Roger Ebert actually makes a good point here that strikes to the heart of our problem. That even if you could make a narrative that somehow molded itself perfectly to fit each choice that a player made throughout a game and make sense, would it be as good as a story where a game writer had full authorial control over it? Well, this brings us on swiftly to our next game, and I'll give you a quick hint. It rhymes with The Last of Us. Now, whilst the very advanced system of choice and narrative consequence is relatively new in a game like Cyberpunk 2077, the problem that it encounters is not unique to it, and it's actually been with video games for as long as they've existed. It's gone by a lot of names in the past, but the most common one for it is the problem of internal or narrative consistency. What it is in its simplest form is like an NPC telling you this long story about how their child got murdered, but your character is just like sprinting laps around them because you're bored. Because games give the players control, it is almost in our nature that we're going to use that power to do dumb shit that is inconsistent with the world the game's trying to build or the story it's trying to tell. So what game designers use to stop that is a thing called the illusion of choice. It's essentially like a law of game design that everything the player seems to have chosen to do of their own free will has still at one point been predetermined by the game designer. The player never has true control to do something that would actually break the game. An example of the kind of curbs on freedom to maintain consistency are like the Legion of Invincible Children in Skyrim. Like, we had to make a mod so that we could kill them, because human ingenuity is a wonderful thing. But this is not just a question of consistency, it is also just a matter of resources. The more choice and freedom that you give the player, the more work you have to do as a game designer, that you have to code in and design every eventuality the player might explore with that freedom and choice. This is why it is so hard, maybe even impossible, to include meaningful player choice in video game narratives. A writer from BioWare excellently summed it up where he said, imagine you have to write a scene where one potentially dead character talks to another potentially dead character about an event that might have happened or might have not. This is why even in games like The Walking Dead or Life is Strange, where their main mechanic is player choice and narrative consequence, still make heavy use of the illusion of choice. Like, you may make a choice that ends up in a side character getting killed, but your story will still converge to the same story beats as other players who didn't make that choice. But this illusion allows them the authorial control as game designers to tell an effective story. So in The Walking Dead, every player got that big sad ending that is now remembered as iconic. The only problem is that gamers are becoming wise to this illusion, and they want more meaningful choice in video games. They want the power to make stories that feel completely unique to themselves. But it raises the genuine question that if all choice in video games is inherently based on an illusion, are we wrong to want for more meaningful ones when it's all fake anyway? Not only that, but one of the best game stories that I've ever played is a game that has absolutely no choice in it. The Last of Us. Because the lack of player choice in that game allows Naughty Dog to tell a very specific story. You play as Joel, a guy whose daughter dies at the beginning, and he loses everything but the will to survive. But eventually he learns to live for more than that when he takes protection of this young girl, who is also potentially humanity's last hope for a cure. He then makes the very unutilitarian decision to trade the entire world's salvation for his own selfish love of this young girl, and then he lies to her about what he really did. The point is that Naughty Dog very easily could have included player choice in The Last of Us. They could have let players decide for Ellie to be operated on or not to lie to her at the end, but it would have just jeopardized that very specific story, and it wouldn't have been anywhere near as good. Now, you may argue that this makes it more of a movie than a game, but you'd be missing out on such a huge part of why The Last of Us worked, and it's something that relies heavily on the interactivity of the medium. And it's how Naughty Dog aligns the player with the character of Joel through gameplay. By forcing players to do a lot of things that, if given the choice, they wouldn't have done, it fully immersed them in the shoes of Joel. You couldn't do anything inconsistent with his character. So after 20 hours of playing from Joel's perspective, when you get to that ending where he breaks Ellie out of the hospital, maybe you wouldn't have made the same choice with him, but the connection you feel in that moment, controlling him, running down the hallway, is unparalleled. It's one of the best moments in video games, and with that, my hot take is finally done. However, even with total control over a video game narrative, it does not guarantee an effective and cohesive experience for every player. Because in 2020, Naughty Dog decided to take their experiment of a lack of choice and player alignment to a new level with The Last of Us 2, and it was a fucking nightmare. Its story essentially split players in half. You either loved it or you hated it, and the people that hated it repeated similar criticisms, that they didn't want to do anything that Ellie did in the game, so they felt no connection to her whatsoever. Alana Pierce, for example, mentioned that the big ending set piece where Ellie decides to spare Abby, the person that she's murdered half of Seattle to get to, should have been a choice. And whilst I think, yeah, you could totally put a choice there, I don't think it would really solve anything. It would just compromise the very specific story that Naughty Dog were trying to tell about revenge and forgiveness. It's just a story that didn't land for many people. Now, at the same time, Alana is a writer for Sony Santa Monica. I'm 23 years old and have to wait for my parents to go on walks so I can shoot these videos. So we will call it a draw. But the point out of all of this is that there is still a clear hunger for games to push what the medium is capable of. And the way many players think they're going to do that is by including meaningful player choice. It does seem an impossible balance that games have to reach between telling an effective and consistent story and giving players freedom and choice. Well, I think it's finally time that we move on to The Witcher 3. Remember, that is the game I talked about in the introduction. That was about 20 minutes ago now. I do wonder if anyone's still watching. So after my disastrous experience with the main story of Cyberpunk 2077, I was very hesitant going into The Witcher 3. I just desperately didn't want the same experience where whether I got a satisfying ending or not was almost entirely down to how lucky I got with the big ending choices. So for a lot of my time with The Witcher 3, I was actually very much the opposite of relaxed, because I was putting more thought into some of these choices than I have to many in my actual life. And one of the first big choices that you make in The Witcher 3 is in a quest line with a character called the Bloody Baron. Now, I was very aware of this character because there's a lot of hype around his quest line. It's now remembered as like one of the best in gaming history. So when I was playing this quest, I was paying attention to every detail. I was listening to every optional dialogue because I wanted to make the right choice when this quest inevitably gave me one. It's the story of this complex, deeply flawed man who has hurt his family and now just wants to get them back. He's kind of like medieval Tony Soprano. And throughout the quest, I did a lot of stuff with the Baron that involved me making lots of choices. So I got in a fist fight with him, I played him at cards, I helped banish the ghost of the unborn child that he inadvertently murdered. It was a real white boy summer. Eventually, on your trails to find his family, you encounter this coven of witches, and they set you off on a quest to kill this evil tree demon in exchange for info on his wife's location. And when you find the tree demon, you are given the choice whether to kill it like the witches asked you to, or to betray them and spare it. Now, I wasn't really liking the vibe that these witches gave off, and video game choices in the past had generally taught me that sparing was the good option, so I went ahead and did that, not realizing that this was the most important choice in the Bloody Baron questline. Basically, the consequences of my decision involved the demon escaping and murdering an entire village, the witches enacting revenge by turning the Baron's wife into a water hag, and the Baron being so overcome with grief that he hangs himself from a tree and the quest ends. And I was just there like, whoopsie daisy. But I was just really frustrated that after trying so hard to do this quest well, a choice that I thought was seemingly unconnected to the Bloody Baron ended up ruining the whole ending of the story for me. So I thought, I'm just gonna act like that didn't happen, I'm gonna reload a save and do the other choice where I kill the tree demon. But even as I redid that choice so I could get the ending with the Baron reunited with his wife, I just felt kind of empty. It was meaningless because I knew that wasn't what I had chosen. It's like Elton John's hair, like it's nice, but I know it's built on lies. The whole point of making these choices is so that it immersed me more in the story, and reloading a save just totally breaks that immersion. I knew I should have just stuck with the choice I made, but I just couldn't face the harsh reality of getting a bad ending. But then I played on, and I started to realize something. Hello everyone, and welcome to the new RU in Studios, It's My Bedroom. But where were we? Look, The Witcher 3 showed me the future of choice in video games, and one of the main ways it did that was by helping me to embrace the bad ending. Because firstly, the world of The Witcher is very similar to the world of Game of Thrones in the way that it is generally a brutal and tragic place where bad stuff happens all the time. But what that does is it creates the context where bad endings don't feel as narratively inconsistent as they would in another game. But the world isn't just inherently tragic, it's also morally complex and grey. So for a lot of the choices in the game, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong option. So for the Bloody Baron, the whole quest foreshadows whether you think he is deserving of forgiveness and whether he should reunite with the family that he's abused. Not only that, but the village that gets destroyed have actually been sacrificing orphans to the witches for years to satisfy prophecy. And if you kill the demon to get that ending where the Baron and his wife both live, a bunch of those orphans get eaten by the witches. And it's because of this that it subverts the whole problem of including choice in video games when there is one best or obviously intended ending. In The Witcher 3, the best choice or ending is usually whichever one you think is the best. I stopped navigating the story being scared of the outcomes of my choices not being the best or most satisfying, and started being excited to how unique they could be to my own experience. But it's not just that making the bad choices are less bad in The Witcher 3, making the good choices are just genuinely like cocaine. I know you think I'm exaggerating, but for example, there's this one side quest where you have to hunt down a vampire serial killer. That's a side quest, play this game. But you don't know that at first. You see, they're like these ritualistic 7-like murders, and eventually you track down your main suspect, red-handed, about to murder the next victim. Now here you are given the choice to just straight up kill him there. I mean, he looks very guilty, and if you do that, then it's not necessarily a bad ending to the quest. But if you pick a certain choice asking about the earlier murders, you find out that it wasn't that guy, and the real mastermind is still at large. You then find out it's a guy that's been under your nose the entire time, and is in fact a vampire. And when you finally confront that guy, and you get this cutscene where he goes like, "Ah, Geralt, I see you discovered my master plan." It wasn't like he was talking to Geralt, but like he was talking to me, because I made the unique choice as the player that found him out. I know that sounds really sad, but look, it's 2021, it's been a year of lockdown, a vampire noticed me and I got excited. leave me alone. Of course, the inherent drawback of this is that it is dependent on you making specific choices, and a lot of players will miss that experience that I got and will not see how deep that quest goes. But I realised that that level of immersion and narrative payoff I felt in that moment is what all the hype of choice in video games was about, and I started to believe it a bit. But once again, we come to the main quest line, and for all that stuff I just said about me learning to embrace the bad ending and loving choice in video games, I still googled half the decisions here. I feel slightly more justified in this, because whilst I want to champion The Witcher 3 as showing us a glimpse of the future of choice in video games and how powerful it can be in its storytelling, I think it is only a glimpse. Because in the main storyline of The Witcher 3, we are once again faced with a system of player choice very much clashing with a conventional narrative. The main story of The Witcher 3 is about you as Geralt trying to find Ciri, who's your surrogate daughter, as she is being pursued by the Wild Hunt. And once you do find her, how you develop your relationship with her is what determines what ending you're going to get to the whole game. Basically, if you're a good dad, you get one of the two good endings, and if you're a bad dad, you get the one very bad ending. And the bad ending of this game is very bad. Like, if you want to see denial in its purest form, read the comments on the YouTube video of the bad ending to this game. It's just a bunch of people genuinely being like, I actually thought it was very fitting to the story that I got the main character murdered. Now, I know I said earlier that tragic endings don't feel narratively inconsistent in The Witcher 3, but I think the problem of doing it in a main questline that lasts 40 plus hours, that whilst not feeling inconsistent, it is definitely unsatisfying. CD Projekt Red give you 6 choices in the ending portion of the game that affect your relationship with Ciri, and they're really a test about the kind of father figure they want you to be for the sake of the story. Not just one who is supportive, but also respects that Ciri is an adult and can be independent and make her own decisions. And if your choices don't reflect this, then Ciri feels insecure at the end and she dies in a big frost tornado. I'm not going to explain the whole plot, it's very confusing. Now, I am on board for this story. I think it is a good character arc for Geralt to have, but I take issue with how CD Projekt Red try and tell that story through the choices that they give you as the player. Like, a couple of the key choices you have to make are pretty straightforward morally, but then there are others that are a lot more vague and harder to navigate as a player. So for example, there's a scene where Geralt decides to give Ciri advice after she's frustrated training, and you're given 2 options on what to say to her. One of these choices ends up in Geralt and Ciri having a snowball fight, and it's a positive choice. The other one instills doubt in her and ends up in Geralt giving her alcohol. The problem is that it's not very clear from the choices they give you what they would have led to in the story. They both seem pretty similar. Most players like me just got lucky and picked the right choice that ended in the snowball fight. I mean, I'm not asking for one of them to be like, you are shit at being a wizard, Ciri, but you get what I mean. And it's not just the outcomes of some of these choices being vague, but there's also a lot less room for you to have your own unique reasoning in your choices as there were in the side quests. So for example, there's a moment in the story where Ciri finds out that a close friend of hers has betrayed her and she starts wrecking this guy's workshop. You then have the choice to either let her do that or tell her to calm down. Now it's clear the choice that CD Projekt Red wants you to make in that moment, a Geralt that allows her to be an independent person who can vent her anger. That's fine, but it can easily clash with the many other reasons that players might have in making the other choice. In the moment, you might think it's better for Geralt's character that he tries to teach her that there are moments where you have to control your emotions. The guy's workshop who she's wrecking is also a close ally of yours, and you may think it's best that she confront him later. Now, of course, I accept that neither of those reasons work in a story where it's supposed to be about Geralt letting Ciri be an independent person. But I think the problem boils down to the fact that player choice implies this freedom, and that you can have your own reasoning behind your choices, that you are immersed in the story. But the reality will always be that that is not true in a conventional narrative. I do want to be clear here, I do think that CD Projekt Red are on the right track, and I don't want to knock them for trying to tell nuanced, complex character moments through player choice. It's clear from the way that the ending plays out in The Witcher 3 that CD Projekt Red wanted players to have the experience where they didn't realise they were making these big story-altering decisions, and then to flash back at the end and be like, joke's on you, we were watching the whole time, you dingus. But I think if we really want to do that, to really immerse players in video games through choice, then things need to evolve from how it's been done here. I think if your game lasts 40 plus hours and the only meaningful choices you make are 6 arbitrary moments in the endgame, then things are bound to get confusing and stressful for players. I think if we want to tell complex and nuanced stories through choice in video games, then that system of choice needs to be just as complex and nuanced. Now, I understand the problem of resources and how difficult it would be to somehow weave meaningful choice throughout an entire narrative. But over the past year, video games have continued to astound me with what they are capable of. So with player choice, I think it is just a matter of time and evolution before it is really capable of that. If anything, what this experience has taught me is that choice in video games can be great, but it's not this silver bullet that is going to unlock video game storytelling's true potential. At the end of the day, I think video game storytelling is always about creating stories that make the players want to get invested, and having them experience that organically through your gameplay, whether that includes choice or not. Because even in a game with no choice, it can be just as immersive and effective through clever gameplay and effective storytelling. Now, I know I've complained a lot in this video, but I am optimistic about the future of choice in video games. I think we've just got a way to go to really perfect it. But when we do, I hope that more people get to experience a type of storytelling that can only happen in video games. I want more people to have their vampire noticed me moment, and I personally can't wait.